Shortly before noon we gained the divide above our noon camp of the day before, and there about 2 miles distant we saw our missing horses, feeding over an alkali flat on which grew wild sorrel and other species of sour plants. We rounded them up, and finding none missing, we first secured a change of mounts. The only 2 horses of my mount in this portion of the remuda had both been under saddle the afternoon and night before, and were as gaunt as rails. Honeyman had one unused horse of his mount in the hand, so when taking down our ropes, we halted the horses and began riding slowly around them, forcing them into a compact body. I had my eye on a brown horse of Flood's that had not had a saddle on in a week, and told Billy to fasten to him if he got a chance. This was in violation of all custom, but if the foreman kicked, I had a good excuse to offer. Honeyman was left-handed and threw a rope splendidly, and as we circled around the horses on opposite sides, on signal from him we whirled our lariats and made casts simultaneously. The wrangler fastened to the brown I wanted, and my loop settled around the neck of his unridden horse. As the band broke away from our swinging ropes, a number of them ran afoul of my rope, but I gave the rowel to my grulla, and we shook them off. When I returned the Honeyman, we had exchanged horses and were shifting our saddles. I complimented him on the long throw he had made in catching the brown, and incidentally mentioned that I had read of vaqueros in California who used a 65-foot lariat. "Hell," said Billy, in ridicule of the idea, "there wasn't a man ever born who could throw a 65-foot rope its full length without he threw it down a well." The sun was straight overhead when we started back to overtake the herd. We struck into a little better than a 5-mile gait on the return trip, and about 2 o'clock sighted a band of saddle horses and a wagon camped perhaps a mile forward and to the side of the trail. On coming near enough, we saw at a glance it was a cow outfit, and after driving our loose horses a good push beyond their camp, we turned and rode back to their wagon. "We'll give them a chance to ask us to eat," said Billy to me, "and if they don't, why, they'll miss a hell of a good chance to entertain hungry men." But the foreman with the stranger wagon proved to be a B County Texan, and our doubts did him an injustice, for although dinner was over, he invited us to dismount and ordered his cook to set out something to eat. They had met our wagon, and McCann had insisted on their taking a quarter of our beef, so we fared well. The outfit was from a ranch near Miles City, Montana, and were going down to receive a herd of cattle at Cheyenne, Wyoming. The cattle had been bought at Ogallala for delivery at the former point, and this wagon was going down with their ranch outfit to take the herd on its arrival. They had brought along about 75 saddle horses from the ranch, though in buying the herd they had taken its remuda of over 100 saddle horses. The foreman informed us that they had met our cattle about the middle of the forenoon, nearly 25 miles out from Powder River. After we had satisfied the inner man, we lost no time getting off, as we could see a long ride ahead of us. But we had occasion, as we rode away, to go through their remuda to cut out a few of our horses which had mixed, and I found I knew over a dozen of their horses by the ranch brands, while Honeyman also recognized quite a few. Though we felt a pride in our mounts, we had to admit that theirs were better, for the effect of climate had transformed horses that we had once ridden on ranches in southern Texas. It does seem incredible, but it is a fact nevertheless, that a horse having reached the years of maturity in a southern climate will grow half a hand taller and carry 200 pounds more flesh when he has undergone the rigors of several northern winters. We halted at our night camp to change horses and to unearth our cached tomatoes, and again set out. By then it was so late in the day that the sun had lost its force, and on this last leg in overtaking the herd we increased our gait steadily until the sun was scarcely an hour high, and yet we never sighted a dust cloud in our front. About sundown we called a few minutes' halt, and after eating our tomatoes and drinking the last of our water, again pushed on. Twilight had faded into dusk before we reached the divide which we had had in sight for several hours, and which we had hoped to gain in time to sight the timber on Powder River before dark. But as we put mile after mile behind us, the divide seemed to move away like a mirage, and the evening star had been shining for an hour before we finally reached it, and sighted, instead of Powder's timber, the campfire of our outfit about 5 miles ahead. We fired several shots on seeing the light, in hope that they might hear us in camp and wait. Otherwise we knew they would start the herd with the rising of the moon. When we finally reached camp about 9 o'clock at night, everything was in readiness to start, the moon having risen sufficiently. Our shooting, however, had been heard, and horses for a change were tied to the wagon wheels, while the remainder of the remuda was under herd in charge of Rod Wheat. The runaways were thrown into the horse herd while we bolted our suppers. Meantime, McCann informed us that Flood had ridden that afternoon to the Powder River in order to get the lay of the land. He had found it to be 10 or 12 miles distant from the present camp, and the water in the river barely knee-deep to a saddle horse. Beyond it was a fine valley. Before we started, Flood rode in from the herd and said to Honeyman, "I'm going to send the horses and wagon ahead tonight, and you and McCann want to camp on this side of the river, under the hill, and just a few hundred yards below the ford. Throw your saddle horses across the river and build a fire before you go to sleep, so we will have a beacon light to pilot us in case the cattle break into a run on scenting the water. The herd will get in a little after midnight, and after crossing, we'll turn her loose just for luck." It did me good to hear the foreman say that the herd was to be turned loose, for I had been in the saddle since 3 that morning and had ridden over 80 miles, and now had 10 more in sight, while Honeyman would complete the day with over 100 to his credit. We let the remuda take the lead in pulling out, so that the wagon mules could be spurred to their utmost in keeping up with the loose horses. Once they were clear of the herd, we let the cattle into the trail. They had refused to bed down, for they were uneasy with thirst, but the cool weather had saved them any serious suffering. We all felt gala as the herd strung out on the trail. Before we halted again, there would be water for our dumb brutes and rest for ourselves. There was lots of singing that night. "There's one more river to cross," and "Roll, Powder, roll," were wafted out on the night air to the coyotes that howled on our flanks, or to the prairie dogs as they peeped from their burrows at this weird caravan of the night, and the lights which flickered in our front and rear must have been real jack-o'-lanterns or will-o'-the-wisps to these occupants of the plain. Before we had covered half the distance, the herd was strung out over 2 miles, and as Flood rode back to the rear every half hour or so, he showed no inclination to check the lead and give the sore-footed rear guard a chance to close up the column. But about an hour before midnight, we saw a light low down in our front, which gradually increased until the treetops were distinctly visible, and we knew that our wagon had reached the river. On sighting this beacon, the long yell went up and down the column, and the herd walked as only long-legged, thirsty Texas cattle can walk when they scent water. Flood called all the swingmen to the rear, and we threw out a half-circle skirmish line covering a mile in width, so far back that only an occasional glimmer of the lead light could be seen. The trail struck the Powder on an angle, and when within a mile of the river, the swing cattle left the deep-trodden paths and started for the nearest water. The left flank of our skirmish line encountered the cattle as they reached the river and prevented them from drifting up the stream. The pointmen abandoned the leaders when within a few hundred yards of the river. Then the rear guard of cripples and sore-footed cattle came up, and the 2 flanks of horsemen pushed them all across the river until they met, when we turned and galloped into camp, making the night hideous with our yelling. The longest dry drive of the trip had been successfully made, and we all felt jubilant. We stripped bridles and saddles from our tired horses and unrolling our beds.